Spawnable is the premier podcast spotlighting people of color. Every week, we talk news, what we've been playing, and tell you who's invited to the cookout. Our show is all about talking about gaming through a prism of blackness, because we are the culture. Welcome to Chicago, y'all.
Yo, welcome to the Spawnable podcast with Kahlief Adams. I'm your host, Kahlief Adams. I hope you're doing well and having a wonderful, dope part of your week. We have a really fun episode for you this week because it feels like there is a ton of information and a ton of misinformation, or at least I wouldn't say misinformation. I just feel like it's misplaced information out in the space. And it, you know, the universe is always kind of talking to you and trying to figure out good ways to tell you that maybe you should drop the content that you were supposed to do this week. So we have the amazing Ben Kvalo, who is the CEO of Midwest Games, on our show this week. And one of the things that I've been talking about, at least been seeing in the space, has been so many discussions around, you know, what's happening in the gaming space around Game Pass. We just had the major layoffs that we talked about in our previous episode this week that came from Microsoft, with 9,000 people being unemployed or being laid off. And, you know, one of the things that we try to do on the show is like have discussions with people who know things, right? So I think one of the things that has gotten me really excited about this episode was we have someone who's in the space who's been making these moves over, you know, a fair amount of time in Ben, and having him on the show to talk about what he's been seeing. And, you know, I wanted to dig into a little bit of like the philosophy of what publishers do, alongside talking about some other layers of the industry that I think for me personally have been worrying, and some things that I've seen that have not been great, but also being able to give people another perspective on how some of this stuff works. So we talked a little bit about Game Pass. We talked a little bit about what publishers do and how they benefit developers, and a little bit of like how that kind of trickles down to the player in some of those ways too. So we have it's a long episode. It's about an hour and 20 of Ben talking about, and Ben and I talking about various parts of the way the system works. And I think it's a really good listen, especially if you're trying to figure out like, what does all of this mean in the grand scheme? You know, I think it's different for players as it's very different for developers, but I think Ben came through with some really salient and smart points, and I think it's a really fantastic interview that you should be checking out. So without further ado, let's check out the interview with Ben Kvalo from Midwest Games. What's good, everybody in Chicago? What the deal be? I hope you're all doing well and having a fantastic week. I'm very excited to have someone who I've been dying to get on the show for a while, somebody who I've looked up to in terms of so many things that they've been doing in the space for a long time, and been able to really give us some good insights about the kind of current state of the gaming space, and especially on the kind of publisher side of things. Ben Kvalo from Midwest Games, CEO of Midwest Games. How are you doing, sir? How's everything going?
I'm doing good. You know, I am enjoying the lake life in Wisconsin this summer, and try not to get too sunburned. And yeah, it's been really good lately.
What's the SPF up to these days? What are you working?
For my skin, as high as possible. 100, 200? I don't know.
Industrial white paint at this point, just covered your body.
Yeah.
Make sure the sun does not get in there in any form or fashion.
Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. You know, we've been trying to get this on the schedule for a minute. We've been ships in the night trying to get things together, but really happy you're here. And it feels like apropos of all the news that has kind of come up this week that you're here. And before we get into that stuff, I think, you know, one of the things I've been really excited about in terms of having you on is it is rare when you get a chance to see people who you've kind of been adjacent to or been near and seeing their career grow in the ways that yours has. You know, you worked at 2K, you worked at many other places, and now CEO of Midwest Games, Netflix as well. The current space is really interesting, and I think you have a really good purview on it with the way you are all thinking about Midwest Games. But I don't know if some of our audience or the kind of, you know, full general audience knows exactly what Midwest is doing, and how you're kind of tackling and approaching, you know, pulling in studios, pulling in games that you're looking to publish and kind of give to the world. So talk a little bit about, you know, your work at Midwest and some of your background in the space.
Yeah, so, you know, I began my career actually in radio before I went into video games, and then worked my way up within video game publishing beginning at 2K, kind of in an operational role that I've allowed me to really get and work across every different kind of business unit that publishing touches, and working directly with developers as well. And so worked my way up within that company, helped to build the core technical group over there, helped to reorg the global marketing organization, spent a lot of time living internationally, went to work for Blizzard, worked in esports for a while. So jumping from AAA, and we were doing some mobile and some other things, but mainly premium type of content into esports. And then Netflix came calling. They were building out a films unit, and I was the first hire in the marketing operations team for film at Netflix. And then, after 3 years of helping to build and scale that, which was insane, one of the first films I worked on has been seen by over 1 billion people, Bird Box. Go from like that kind of scale and that kind of, global impact, and then I jumped back into games because Netflix wanted to do games. And so I led the launch of the product for Netflix Games. And so that was kind of where it was coming from. But what I saw was, as I was imagining, like, how do we create larger impact? How do we change how the industry operates? Like, going from like this macro kind of environment I was in to thinking about the micro kind of ecosystems that exist throughout the world, in the United States. And 62% of the industry is in California, Washington, Texas, in the U.S. So it's like, how do we disrupt that? How do we change where games come from in the U.S.? And how could that lead to larger changes around the world if we can prove out, hey, if you can do this in the Midwest, you can do this anywhere. And what are some of the benefits from that? So changing where, but then as we were going through the process, thinking about how we change the models and some of the things that exist, traditional publishing and things like that. And so as much as we started as very much a traditional publisher trying to do things lower cost, different places, we then found a new avenue, which we call shadow publishing, which essentially is a for-hire publishing service that allows us to provide these really key services to really anyone. Now you have to budget for it, obviously, like it's a paid service. But what we don't do is then we don't take rev share, we don't take IP rights, we don't have long-term strings attached, because even if someone doesn't take IP rights, guess what? A publisher will make sure that they have their hand in whatever happens in the future in one way or another. There's a lot of legal ways to set that up. And so this creates an alternative, and it's not for everybody, but it is an option. And I think there's a lot of other models that need to be explored. And so that's kind of been what the build up to what Midwest Games is. And we're really trying to challenge all the existing ways of doing things and think about them in different places and in different ways.
I think one of the things that we try to do on our show is be a bridge between the player and the industry in terms of talking to smart folks like you who have seen the process of how the soup gets made, right? So I think one of the things that you touched upon is like not doing the publishing role or being in the publishing role in the kind of traditional sense. Can you break down what that is for folks? Because I don't even think they know what that means, right? Yeah. They're like, we see a name in the beginning credits that show up on a game, and like we kind of know what they do, but what's the actual role of a publisher when working with a studio or working with a developer?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of folks will take, and think about a publisher and they'll think like, a lot of folks think they're developing the game. They're not developing the game, but yet they have a really key support role in enabling something to come to market. So if you think about what a traditional publisher, and if we go back in time a little bit, a traditional publisher was the people trying to or helping to distribute the games because they own the pipelines to store shelves into places like Walmart or GameStop or any place that sold games. They were the way in so that you could get your game not only on storefronts, but featured in bigger ways. You would see cardboard cutouts and you would see things like that. That happened because a publisher had a relationship, and what was beneficial about a publisher is they could leverage their existing portfolio to kind of be like, hey, this is our new game. We want featuring. Because even if there wasn't a lot of hype around it, you could be like, I have this game, and we know it does really well. You sell a lot of units in your store. If you want to get more, we need you to support this other game. So they had leverage, and that gave them a lot of ability to push someone's game forward, but it created a force like funnel into the publishing end of things, and publishers took a lot of rights away from that, but they also paid for a lot of the development. So traditionally, what a publisher really does is they provide funding, and then they provide access to platforms, and then the support mechanisms around it. They're constantly going to market, and we know a video game can take anywhere from, I mean, these days a lot shorter, but like even 12 months at least, right? But 18 months to 7 years. So if you're only going to market once every, let's say, 2 to 3 years, a lot changes. Like think about 3 years ago in the video game industry. It was a completely different environment than it is today. But publishers are always going to market. So they know the best practices, they know the contacts, they know who's still at a company because people shift companies all the time. They just know all of those things because they're constantly going to market. And then they have resources that are dedicated towards the practice of going to market, like release management, QA, localization. Like they have these things ingrained in their process, whether it's internal or external, because they're constantly going to market. They know how to do this, and so they're able to do it faster, cheaper, and ultimately make sure that you're doing it right, because you can really ruin a launch if you don't do these systems right. And so that's what they provide. Now, a lot of that's changed over the years. We're now in a digital world where who cares if they own, slots in Target? That doesn't matter unless that's part of your strategy.
Right.
But that is a fraction of the total sales these days. And so the advantages a publisher has more so are, okay, well, do they have advantages on Steam because of their portfolio? You see somebody like Hooded Horse, who, because they have such an incredible portfolio of strategy and tactic games, anybody that gets in with them, well, they get connected to that portfolio, and there's a natural advantage to that. So there's still some heavy advantages, but they're very different advantages than they used to be. And so things have just really changed in the environment, and not all of the deal terms have changed. Like a lot of it's still based on the very traditional ways of doing things, because the entire publishing industry was built in a way that is like 30, 40 years old. And because they've structured their businesses in those ways, all their deal terms are structured in that way. And the models are meant to support that way of working. And now we're in a whole different environment where that doesn't work as well anymore. It still works because publishers, if you look at like Steam, I think the stat is about 1.74% of games have a publisher. It's a little bit hairy. I'm always like willing to say under 2%, because Steam doesn't do a good job of classifying what is actually a publisher versus not a publisher. But if you look at that, under 2%, they probably make about 90% of the total revenue. So even though they are not making 100% of the revenue, or almost 100% like they used to, they're still making the vast majority. So there is a huge advantage to having publishers, but their hit percentages are going down. Indies are having more success over time. But what we have to realize is publishers know how to make steady success. Indie flash in the pan success, awesome. But will that studio go on to create another hit? Most don't. Whereas publishers know how to keep the hits coming.
It sounds like, I'm happy you talked about your background in radio as a person who also has a background in radio. You talking about the kind of transition that we've seen from the traditional old school versions to what you and the team are doing at Midwest, which feels more akin to, a newer, fresher version of what that looks like. It feels like the conversation we had when we had old school radio execs giving you, deals in those ways. Your A&R would come over and talk to you and be like, "Hey kid, you have a really good act here. Maybe make a record. You want to make a record, kid?" Yeah. Right. That kind of thing. And, those deals weren't necessarily beneficial to the artist. You had a lot of stuff that you had to recoup up front because marketing was paying for it. They were doing all that stuff. And it feels like now, we're seeing that transition from what traditional radio was to how did you sell, your album, then to moving into the streaming services. It seems like this is what's happening now in the gaming space, right? It feels like that same tradition of things having to get different and be better and be more kind of technologically savvy is now translating into the game space because you have so many games, as for one, and you have so many ways for people to make games that you're getting just this glut of so many things all the time. Does it feel like, the discussion that we have, not necessarily too many games, but there are so many that you have to kind of broach, and finding those diamonds in the rough is a lot harder. What's the process look like for you all now in that sense? Are you all targeting very specific stuff that's regional for you as well? Because I know because of the Midwest layer of it, that's super important. But is it something where you're all getting pitched from all these different layers that are coming to you and it's like, we are looking for folks who understand this in a different way? Maybe you can help us. What's the process look like for you all in terms of that layer of the biz dev parts of how it works?
Yeah, I think you are seeing just an enormous wave of games, and I think that it's not that there's too many games, although one could definitely come up with that argument. It's making me choke how many games there are.
Same. I need to go grab water at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you had 19,000 games come out in 2024. I think there'll be 25,000 games that come out in 2025 on Steam. And, it creates there's just, how do you compete? And the problem is of playtime, that 25,000 that potentially will come out this year is competing for 40% of total playtime because 60% is already consumed by games that are 5 years or older. So you have less games, less time and more games. And it's not like the platforms are built for this huge volume. So it's not like they're great at serving these titles. This is not Netflix that is designed specifically to serve a huge amount of people and be able to get the right content to the right people. This is platforms that are trying to A, make money for themselves, and B, make money for their biggest clients, which are the biggest publishers, which is why publishers always win. And so it just creates a huge challenging environment. So how are people cutting through? I used Hooded Horse as an example. That's a genre play, focused in on it, but also they've had an incredible eye for it. They do slightly different terms than most publishers do as well. So some folks are taking that approach of being specific and specialized in certain areas so that they can go after that audience consistently. Some folks are doing, frankly, just predatory behavior. They are trying that. They know that there are more games and they have a less chance of getting investment, which means the publishers can ask for more and better terms for the publishers. And so they do. And they're okay with the fact that a lot of people will say no to it because some people will say yes, and then some of those will work. And they then have incredible terms on that. And so that is one thing some people are doing. And then there's others that are just looking at different ways to approach this whole challenge. And it's really all changed, like the volume and what happened was about 5 years ago, which coincided with COVID as well. The accessibility to make games, and then suddenly this moment where everyone was at home, and what do they want to do? Make games. And then this moment where the industry was booming so much, venture came, which had been in the industry for a couple of years at that point, like 3-4 years, but suddenly decided to come in an insane way. So there was an insane amount of investment, lots of people making games. and we got this huge glut of amount of games, amount of game investment, and it just completely changed how things are done. And I think we're on this other side of things, realizing we have to do things in a completely different way to survive. And not many people are surviving. And so that is, you have to adapt. And that's where we came up with the shadow publishing, because we were looking at, well, in our role, what we're doing, how could we best serve who we're trying to support, which could be game developers, it could be other game publishers, it could be other entertainment companies. It could be really anyone someone coming into games that doesn't really know games well. Well, we could support any of those kinds of folks. And so for us, we saw that as an opportunity. And then we looked at our advantages as a publisher, and we're in a low cost region. We operate at about 30% of the industry average. And so that allows us to go, okay, well, we don't have to do business the same way these other publishers are doing business. We could do it differently, where we can work for clients and support them, but then be able to take, some of the money that we make off of that and maybe turn that into investments or turn that into other opportunities or other business ventures that we do. And so we just have to operate differently. So I think everyone is reacting to it a little bit differently. Some people are creating funds. Some people are, looking at buying up back catalog, because 60 to 70% of a publisher's revenue every year comes from back catalog. So there's a lot of opportunities with a publisher being like, okay, I'm going to buy a bunch of back catalog. That creates revenue opportunity that I can then take debt against that revenue and then invest that into additional investments. And so there's suddenly a whole new wave of different ways of looking at how to build out a catalog, how to build out a publisher, and you see a number of new publishers popping up out of that.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about the ways that the funding and financing is working, especially because, like you said, that number of 25,000 just made me want to cry, because I'm like, I don't know, like, that 60-40 split is real, and as a person who's on the other end of that spectrum, that's like, my inbox is full every day with new games that people are like, can you cover this? Can you showcase this? Can you stream this for our client? And there just isn't enough time in the day to be able to do that stuff. And I feel bad often because I'm like, I can't help because I don't have enough time to get through the game and do it properly. You know what I mean? Like, what's the stuff that you're seeing on that end too, of like, how are you advising clients in a world where, again, you're fighting that hard 40, right? That hard 40% is entrenched. It is not moving that much. It probably won't. That's your Roblox, that's your Fortnites, that's a lot of that stuff. How are you kind of approaching and telling folks in that space that, like, 60% is where you're at, and you have to fight for in that 60 with a lot of other folks.
40%.
40, I'm sorry.
So it's the opposite.
The opposite,
60
sorry. I got the numbers mixed.
Yeah. So it's like, it's even worse, right? It's even like, it's, and not only are you competing with them, famously Reed Hastings, who was the founder and CEO of Netflix, said, while I was still working there, that, we're not competing with Disney Plus, we're competing with Fortnite. But that also means Fortnite is competing with Netflix. And an indie game is competing with Netflix, because it is all a matter of, time. And so when I'm, at the end of the day, which is one of the more congested periods of time in someone's day to compete for entertainment, because I can go, okay, well, I could play a game, I could watch something new, I could watch something old, I could play something old. You have all these choice trees that are happening. And so if you're competing in that space, you have to know, okay, well, if I'm on Steam, I'm going after the PC user. What are they doing during that period? How could I get their attention? Where are they sitting? So you have to really know your audience and who you're going after specifically. Or you have to find pockets where they might play a game in a different way than you might have imagined before. Like, what about the commuters that have a pocket, but it's sometimes 5 minutes? Can you have a game that you can enjoy, jump in really quick, enjoy 5 minutes, put down? Because that could be a way in with somebody. And so you have to rethink how you're doing this and still know that you're going to be competing with a massive amount of people until something changes. I do think relief is coming in the fact that I don't think that these platforms can continue to sustain the volume of content coming out on them. I think at some point there's a tipping point where they have to raise the floor a little bit, where they say, hey, it's not just going to be $100 to be able to put something on Steam. It's going to be $1,000. It's going to be $10,000, whatever that is, because that will change the amount of games going out, because it's hard to justify putting your game on Steam for $1,000 or $10,000. Like $10,000, you would cut a lot of that 25,000 out. And then you would really have to think about, can I, as a business, as a game developer running as an entrepreneur, can I justify $10,000 because I know I'm going to make at least $10,000 and at least break even off of this project. And it suddenly becomes a business decision. Whereas $100, anyone could spend $100 on something to be like, I'm going to spend $100 on that just to put it out there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where there's a potential change coming down the line. It's just, when does that happen? And it could happen at any point, because it's not like Steam doesn't see this. There's not like these other platforms don't see it. But you look at Xbox or PlayStation, the reason their volume isn't as high on those is because the barrier is drastically higher to get on those platforms.
And to be fair, I mean, I think it's been a pain point for everyone in the funnel, right? Where like curation has been bad for a long time. Like, you mentioned the conversation around Netflix and, Netflix kind of competing with Fortnite competing with Netflix in those ways. But like, even within Netflix, there is a layer of the algorithm tending towards your own needs and your own understandings and your own, what you're looking at, what you're watching all the time. It doesn't feel like that on, like, you can wish list stuff on Steam and all those things, but like, there is no algorithmic way that it's kind of looking at your catalog and feeding you things that feel new and fresh and interesting in that stuff. Like, you may find a thing, currently still the best version of that is word of mouth, right? Like, I think a lot of folks are still in that space. And, as much as people are like, journalists aren't necessary anymore, like, people are still paying attention to what folks in this space are talking about in those ways and saying like, hey, this may be a thing you want to check out. It just feels like we're at, like you said, that tipping point. And maybe you're right. Like that raising the guardrails a little bit might help us get to even more and kind of better things bubbling up to the top, which is what we need.
Well, it has to happen at some point. You think about like imagine, let's just put it into an analogy that makes it just ridiculous what's happening right now. Imagine if anybody could put out a film in a theater. The amount of like film posters that would be up on the walls of the theater, it would be insanity. And there's a barrier for a reason.
Yeah.
And if we want a healthier development ecosystem, as much as like the counter argument to this is, hey, this small indie game that blew up by a single developer wouldn't have been made or wouldn't have been released on Steam. As much as there's that, if we want a healthier, more sustainable ecosystem for game developers, we do have to have a higher barrier, because that is, when you create a more professional environment with more professional platforms, it creates an ability to create a more sustainable ecosystem. Now, it doesn't guarantee it. It depends on how it's all set up. And it doesn't mean that there's not other platforms that are right for that single person developer that maybe doesn't have the resources, didn't get the publishing to release something. You have a lot of other platforms that could do that. And it's more so that, especially Steam as the largest PC platform, has to do something about the ecosystem they're building and how I think they're actually harming developers without developers realizing it. Because they are able to put their game out, but they're not able to build a sustainable studio, which is what we should all be caring about. That means that the only ones that can are these large publishers. And we see what they do with the power that they have. It doesn't create a more sustainable ecosystem by them having that either, because ultimately they are just looking for the profit that is necessary, because many of them are public companies, or they ultimately answer to the shareholders. We want more sustainable game development. We need a higher barrier, and we need to be supporting developers in a way that they keep their revenue and that they keep their IP rights, because that allows them to create a long-term successful studio, which we should be cheering for studios that have had multiple successes, not just the flash in the pan, because that money and that studio can go away with their next release, especially if they have a publisher that is taking rev share IP rights, because guess what? They're only getting a fraction of that. Even at 50% of the rev share between publisher developer, remember the platform's taking 30%. So then you're talking, okay, we're talking about 35%. You're getting 35% of that money. Is that enough to make a sustainable developer? And then you have a successful title, but guess what? That publisher has rights to that next iteration and the iteration after that. And you're suddenly cutting away at things over and over and over, and the developer ends up with less and less and less. And so the only way to make this sustainable is for developer to really take on the burden of the business of their game development, budget for services that are related to publishing, whether it be through a service like what we provide in Shadow Publishing, or individually, hiring these different services. So there is other ways to do it, but we haven't encouraged an ecosystem to help support what I think is a more sustainable way of development.
And it feels like there's a conversation in there, and it's funny how it cycles back to music again in my mind of like, there isn't really in movies and TV, like there isn't that royalties ecosystem for developers in that way. Like there just isn't, right? Like it's not a thing where if you made a game 10 years ago and it's still getting some sales here and there, you're going to see that random check for, 15 cents or whatever it might be that people, I see that with actors all the time of being like, oh, I got this random thing from a commercial I did 15 years ago when I was a child actor, like that kind of stuff. You're not seeing that happen in the game space, while also so much turmoil in the space in terms of studio closures and all of that. A thing that you're dealing with on a consistent basis is the finding of funding for games and figuring out where that's coming from and trying to do that in the most ethical ways that you possibly can, and trying to find out what is that thing that's going to give that game that push in a much bigger way with a oversaturated market that I feel like is probably unsustainable. Like not even just from a how are you going to get everybody paid, but like no one can see everything, like even for coverage, for players, for any of that stuff. Are you seeing?
Well,
I want to pivot
to what you're saying. Just before we pivot, to what you're saying, I think we also have to look back, because you use music and movies as examples. Remember that at one point, the issues that we're facing, they face too.
Right.
And then they work through getting to the point that, they have some of these different rights. There's unions, there's other things that happened off the back of a lot of turmoil. So I just think we have to remember the industry is only 40, 50 years old in comparison to 100-plus-year-old industries. And we're young in the scheme of things, and we are still going through it. And our bubble burst just now with COVID, and suddenly we have to react to it. So I think there's going to be a lot of change happening that will create that next wave of like, what does the industry look like on the back end of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is, and I agree. Like I think we're still trying to figure it out. We're flying and playing as we build it, kind of deal. I hate that terminology. I hate that saying, but it's true. It's like the other one is like, you got to eat our own dog food. I hate that shit. It's stupid. But, but like, you're right. It's that layer of we are still trying to figure this out while we're building this thing that is ballooned and grown in a way that no one, foresaw. Like, being bigger than most entertainment in this space is different than what I think a lot of folks who got into this believed we might be able to do. but it also has
Mm-hmm.
brought a lot of different problems and a lot of different solutions that need to kind of come through. I do want to talk a little bit about regional differences because of what you're trying to do with Midwest Games. I think one of the things that I think about is, I moved west to try to stay in the industry and try to kind of get a foothold in it. I would have loved for there to have been more stuff in New York when I was there. And now we're seeing pockets, like you said, East Coast, West Coast, South, and now Midwest, where a lot of folks, they usually think of the traditional studios that were there for a long period of time, the Midways, the now the Iron Galaxies, all of those spaces now, NetherRealm and other folks, WB out there. Are there really specific regional differences between the folks that are building in those spaces and the games that you're seeing coming out of the Midwest than they are on the coast? Are you seeing really different ideas kind of pop up within that space?
I think naturally, and I saw it at Netflix on the films end of things, as we invested heavily into regional content. That was in the era when Squid Games, and before that, the German content like Dark, and others. When you invest into other regions and other places, you naturally get new ideas or new approaches on how to do something, because those folks haven't had the ability to have themselves be seen, within games, or on the big screen, and suddenly they have that ability, and there's new games that come out of that, and there's new approaches and new styles. Because some of it is, yeah, it's great to think about all the best practices and best ways of doing things, and that kind of professionalism is really, really valuable. But also, you want to team that with sometimes a little bit of naive approaches to things, not realizing, making mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes are actually turn into a new approach, a new way of doing something. And so there's some inefficiency with that, and that's where I'm like, if you can team both, where you get some of the best practices and professionalism with some of the new approaches of this, it actually creates an environment where you get a lot of new ideas and just new ways of approaching it. And so what I see in the Midwest is a different culture. It's a different way of life, different values. Even in people that do white collar work, there's a blue collar mentality with everything, and you're not handed anything. It is outside of the realm of like even thinking about things, to think that someone else would pay you to make a game. Like, people just do it themselves, and they go and they don't think, I'm going to get a publishing deal. I'm going to like, there's just an approach with it where, you're going to bootstrap yourself. You're going to figure out, and yeah, if something comes along, awesome, but that's not what they're necessarily looking for. And they're not necessarily doing it for the same reasons that somebody in San Francisco or LA or Seattle might be doing it for. And so it's a completely different mentality that I think creates a lot of opportunity for game making. And I think that's why Wisconsin, has a long, rich history in games. A lot of people don't realize that Dungeons and Dragons was created in Wisconsin and Lake Geneva. Like, the reason Gen Con exists is actually Geneva. Like,
Right.
and then they moved to Indianapolis eventually.
Right.
But there is a long history, and also a game development hub in Madison, Wisconsin. And so you see, a lot of folks that come, and I think similar to your story, like, have to go to the West Coast. But my experience in working at 2K and Blizzard and Netflix is, it felt like at times half the people I was working with were from the Midwest or from the middle of the country in some way. And wait a second, if half of these companies are from these places anyways, what if you create opportunities in these places that are lower cost, better quality of life? I mean, in Wisconsin, you can buy a house for less than $300,000. That's the average house, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, with property. It's insane in comparison to places like California. And I love California. I'm not one to crap on it. It's just, ultimately there's some real downsides to it. And let's give people an option to be in these other places. And I think we're going to get incredible outcomes. Hardworking folks that just want opportunity might not have had the ability to relocate their lives to somewhere else for this industry that we can suddenly bring to them.
I mean, you're speaking to the choir on that one. I'm down for that in every way possible, because I know I have been harping for them to figure out making a new studio here in Portland, here in Oregon, because I'm like, it's the perfect in between spot between, very expensive and very expensive. Like how do you find a good spot here for that? But I'd love to hear you talk about the different stories you're hearing and kind of seeing within the games that you're signing for the work you all do. And also really cool to see you're all working not only just in the Midwest, but also internationally too, with the Legend of Babu, with the team out in Turkey. Like, are there also learnings there that folks are, the regional kind of cultural exchange that is happening through those discussions and through those signings and things like that? Like, are you seeing very specific things happen in those discussions as well, where you're bringing a very, either, Midwestern or American, understandings of how this all works to international folks too, to be able like, this is what the market looks like here. Although it is a very international industry, here's the way it may be received in the States and all those kinds of things. What's that been like for working with folks out of the country as well?
Yeah, what's incredible about it is game development knows no boundaries. And folks have been able to learn, they have the tools that, like, the accessibility to be able to create games is truly global. Now, what is missing in these other places is kind of the knowledge and know-how around publishing and how to put out a game, the go-to-market practices, and frankly, the network and connections. They're owned by very few people in very few places around the world. And that makes it extremely challenging to get that exposure. And if you think about it, like, name one university that teaches games publishing.
Right.
That's not a thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. You only learn it if you go and work for a publisher. And there's only about 200 to 300 publishers worldwide. So you have to first get to one of those. And then if you look at a publishing unit, what a lot of people don't realize, they see these big names, but they don't realize the units are actually really small. And the teams, the amount of people that work on a game on a publisher is pretty small. Now, you'll see in the credits a huge list. That's everybody at a publisher. But a publisher naturally has 10 or more projects going on at one time. They're not all working on every project. They split it, they manage resources. You'll have one marketing manager, you'll have one or more producers, you'll have, like, even big AAA projects. Yeah, they might have 5, 6 producers, but still, that's not an enormous amount of people. So publishing from a skill set perspective is something that's really hard to get. But once you have it, it doesn't take many people to do it. And so that naturally hasn't encouraged a outpouring of, like, educational resources towards how to publish, how to use these things, because it's not something you can just easily pick up. You're not going to be able to read some article or watch a video and understand what goes into publishing. And there's 40 plus disciplines that exist in publishing. And so there's a lot there. But if you learn it, then you ultimately have this incredible skill set. But guess what? Most places around the world don't have this, because most of it's in the U.S. Or China, which is a more restricted market, or again, giant hubs. You look at London, you look at Singapore, you look at Paris. You like all the typical giant cities is where there's a lot of the international hubs. And so in those places, there's very few people that know a lot of how to put these things out. And so, and then even if you have worked for a publisher, part of, like, one of the challenges I see is most haven't worked across multiple departments and haven't seen the full publishing picture. Even if you are working in marketing for a publisher, guess what? Your site is on the marketing piece. You are not going deep in the production piece. You are not going into the technical realm and working, with middleware vendors and in dealing with HR and finance and all of these other things that are involved in the publishing unit. Typically, you're focused on your one area, and you just have a team that focuses on a game. And so my argument is, even for folks that have been in publishing, they don't have the vast exposure across all of the different disciplines. Like I mentioned, there's 40 plus different disciplines. And so even the folks that think they know publishing often don't know publishing. And so that, I think, just creates a lot of misinformation around people going out there saying, well, this is how you publish your game. Look at what this indie project did, which is one of my biggest pet peeves, is when someone goes, look at this indie project, look at how they succeeded, and then come up with a bunch of things that miss the whole point of what happened, and the fact that no one will repeat that.
Right.
Because 1,000 people tried it before them, 1,000 people will try it after them, and they're the only ones that are going to succeed in that way. And people just miss that nuance and try to pretend like this is all easy, and it's extremely complicated. It takes an entire team of people, and they are all specialized in certain areas.
God, that just brought up so many other things that I want to talk to you about. But that's brilliant, because I don't think a lot of people understand that, right? I'll even use myself as an example. I'm in what you would consider mid-career. I'm in my mid 40s. Have been in the industry probably about 10 years or so on the social media comms side, community manager side of things. And I'm also looking to repivot, right? But there isn't an avenue for that I can see. Like, it's not like you had when you were in school and you go to your school counselor, it's like, I want to do this job. I need a mentor for this thing. Can you help me figure out what that thing is and help me figure that out while I'm already employed in a position and doing a thing that takes all of your day and all of your time? And there aren't real avenues for secondary learning in the ways that we see in traditional job spaces. One of the things I loved in my time working at Intel was I forgot what they called it, but basically you red badge. And what you wind up doing is, for 6 months, you go work in another BU and you learn what it's like to do that job in that other BU. And there is no avenue for that in games. Is there a space where you're hearing or even seeing even remnants of a discussion of what it's like for folks who are in a job who are like, maybe it's time to pivot? And it maybe not even be because of layoffs. Maybe it's just because you're like, I don't want to do that thing anymore. It's not fun to do anymore. Yep. Or the space doesn't need it as much as it is in that space. Are you hearing or seeing anything in those realms about like avenues for that ability to learn those things that don't involve you either leaving that space or poking at people on LinkedIn for mentorship that are already busy and doing that work? Is there any space for that you've seen at all?
No, I mean, cross training is an art that I think has been lost over time. I think so many people look at someone's background and say that they're only good in this one thing.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to move outside of it. Now, the one opportunity I do see is in the startup world, because the reality of any startup is, you're going to be, the marketing person, but guess what? You're going to have 10 other hats, and you might discover that you really like this other thing and start to go towards that a little bit more. And then you're able to say, oh, well, I have experience in that thing from being in a startup and whatnot. So that is an area that you naturally have to cross train because of the requirements of being in this crazy world of starting up a business. But in any kind of corporate, like, they have so many people that are so specialized in what they do that it's hard to compete unless you become more specialized. Frankly, like, even as I look at my career and in a place like Netflix, the reality of me is I'm a generalist that does a lot of things, has a good amount of knowledge in each thing, but I'm in no way a specialist. And I'm in no way the expert in any one of these areas. There's always somebody that has vastly more knowledge than me in any one of these areas. I'm just good at bringing it together. And so I'm great in a situation where you're starting up something or building a new initiative. So I worked really well when I was in the early days of 2K. Because they were doing so many different things and they needed to build out a core technical group. So I got to go in the engineering side of things and really learn the challenges of working with a dev and providing these resources and middleware and licensing. I used to just deal with legal agreements nonstop. So I learned all the legalese to the point that one of my investors was like, "You're like a half lawyer," even though I've never there's no professional training, but I used to have to do that. And then I jumped into marketing off of that. And was given those opportunities. And so those kinds of situations are really rare. But then I also look at my career and I look at Netflix and I go, well, Netflix doesn't need a person like me anymore. I mean, they may be doing some of their new initiatives, but they're at a state as a company. And I think each of these companies get there. And you have to kind of be self-aware with who you are, what you're trying to do, and realize once a company gets to this big, large state, they don't need someone like me. They need someone that's very specialized in certain areas that they are most focused around. And in fact, someone like me is going to cause too much disruption because I'm going to want to continue to build, iterate, grow certain areas. And maybe that's not what their strategic area is anymore. Maybe that's not where they're trying to grow. And luckily, I was given two different opportunities to build and grow within Netflix. But I realized by the 3 years into the films unit, I wasn't really that fit anymore. They need someone just to continue to do what we had built together. And the same with games. And then, so I ultimately realized my route is in startup land, in building new initiatives, we're building new companies. And that's where there is a lot of room for growth, but you have to, with that comes a lot of other challenges and a lot of other risks. So I think it's a lot of folks trying to figure out what is right for them. Are they someone that wants to just dive deeper and deeper and deeper into a role, or they want to be somebody that wants to work across a lot of things? And then you have to go to the company that is trying to do the same kind of thing or has the same kind of needs. I think too often people want to be generalists and then they want to go work for a company like Blizzard or that is well established, doesn't need that in any way anymore. And it's just a mismatch at that point. And then obviously they become probably some of the first on chopping blocks because not because they're not a good employee, because they're just a mismatch with where that company's at in comparison.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, it is you as a employee these days have to be reading the tea leaves way in advance, right? I think when we see sudden things come down the pipeline where we see mass layoffs or things like that, I think a lot of folks either have gotten, I'm not going to say too comfortable in their position because that's not real. That's not the way it works in your own brain because you're just doing your job every day. Yep. But the ability to see what the job is doing and looking at your role and saying, well, I'm in this weird between space where, again, I'm so heads down doing the things that I'm tasked with that I don't have brain space or even time on my calendar to block out to be like, see, here's a time for me that's just for self-learning, or here's a time for mentorship with another person on the team. One of the things that is institutional knowledge that comes across not only from, big umbrellas like publishers where teams are able to, pull in other folks and be able to have, those moments where you're talking and building and understanding, oh, what are you doing on your game? Oh, that's working really well. Here's the thing I'd love to learn from you. I know that that's not happening across teams in most places. So even on an individual employee basis, that's even harder to be able to kind of come together with.
Well, and to that, if we think about where that kind of learning environment started from, it started from places that wanted people to stay for a long time. And I don't think that is the world we live in anymore. No. And so I think the reality is you have to take it on yourself. An employer is not going to do it. They realize it's inefficient for them to do that, even if they have the best of intent. I don't think it's actually a lot of people will want to hammer a company for doing that.
Yeah.
I think it just doesn't. It's the reality of the world today. Is a company's not going to invest heavily into an employee's education outside of their role because they know that their longevity at the company is pretty small, especially in games.
Yeah.
And so they're not going to do those things. So you have to take it on yourself. And what I think is a challenge right now is there's not a lot of opportunities to get those learnings or know where to go to get them because there's not a lot of central resources. So my hope is that we can get more central resources in education. We try to do a monthly for the love of games type of like exposure mechanism where we bring on localization experts or producers or folks that, and they share their expertise and their knowledge from the publishing end of things and, what they do, how they do it, why they do it, as a way of teaching people. Because someone might be like, oh, I've always been, in QA, but I'm really interested in localization. And that creates a route for them to get enough education where they can go, okay, well, here's the skill sets that I have, and here's how we could sell that those are transferable skills to a position in localization or to a producer position.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of transferable skills, but you have to know what those skills you have are and what the skills are of the position you're going for and how much overlap it is. And then you have to sell that to somebody that's going to take a chance on you. And there's just less people giving a chance in this current environment. I hope that changes, but it's probably going to take a couple of years for everything to kind of reset.
Yeah. And one of the most profound pieces of advice I've ever gotten from a higher up or a manager has been, we know what you do well and you know what you want to do. This is also an opportunity to figure out what things you don't like. And that's a really good thing to know. You may think you know, or you may think you like a thing until you actually start doing it. And you're like, oh, no, that's totally not for me, which is also valuable information to be able to pull into a job and a new thing. There's one last piece of stuff I want to dig into with you. And I think it's really apropos and profound because I think the thing that I'm always grappling with is what does the player need, right? I think the conversation that all of these things are in service of a player, right? Building great games, finding good ways to connect with them, finding good ways to do outreach and connect with those folks is an avenue of, at the end of the day, someone has to play your thing and they have to enjoy it, right?
You would hope.
I mean, you'd hope, right? Again, like
you'd hope, but I don't think that's true. I don't think everyone is like that. Because I think it is really, you're always walking a fine line.
Yeah.
Of trying to make it about the player. Because that's at the end of the day, if they're not buying, if they're not interested, but at the same point, if you only ever player forward, that also tends to not work out either. Because I think that's where the people have bent like monetization strategies and other things to try to really bring as many players as possible, but they don't really understand the consumer, the needs, the behaviors of a friend group, all of those things. And so I think there is a lack of understanding of the consumer, and these platforms are not about the consumer. And I think, to something I said earlier, like, it is about the platform making the most amount of money they can and the publishers making money because they are the highest end customer of the platforms. And so they're only going to serve stuff that's going to make them money. My argument is that the future platform, whoever creates it, it's going to be about the player. It's a player curation. It's more like Netflix than it is anything, because the thing that Netflix does that I love, and there's always a lot of mixed feelings about Netflix.
Sure.
But the thing that I love is that, even if it's some big filmmaker, that putting out their next big film, guess what? If you love rom-coms, and that's the lowest cost content that Netflix has, it doesn't matter. They're going to serve the lowest cost content over the high end new movie because they know that that's what you actually want.
Right.
And they know that over the long run, they're going to make consumers more happy by serving the content that they actually want. And that's what we don't have in the space right now.
I agree with you on that. In that point, I think the platforms don't care, right? Like, I think that's one layer of it. I'm curious more about the information that you're absorbing, because I think one of the things that a person in your position and your team is thinking about on a consistent basis is trying to a certain extent match player with game that they see in the space, right? You're like, oh, I am seeing data that this version of player persona is something that's bubbling up more in the space. You know, we had that moment where the Battle Royale player was the persona that everyone was looking after. You know, you had a moment when the cozy game persona was the person that you were looking to tap into for a lot of the indie space for a long period of time. The thing that I'm always a little bit baffled as a person who's doing that work in the kind of community space is, are we actually getting good information from players? And are we actually getting information from players in a way that they understand what they're saying? And we're filtering and consistently filtering to try to figure out how to meet that need. And I think the biggest version of that is the argument that I consistently see between full price game versus the free to play model versus MTX in the middle of all of that, right? Where we have this conversation where everyone is like, games are too expensive. We have the Stop Killing Games movement that's bubbled up in the past couple of weeks around, you know, game sustainability and what we have an expectation for developers to do or ask for developers to do to make sure that games have a long lifespan, because the idea of that you don't own a game is you know, you're licensing games as opposed to you owning them. And now you're having this discussion where everybody and their mama is like, the best way to do it is just make everything free to play. What's the biggest pain point you're seeing in that kind of confluence, in that weird Venn diagram? What's the thing that players kind of don't understand that they're asking for when they're asking for things like that? And how does that affect the development of a game, and how does that work?
Well, I think I'll start by saying there will never be only one way of doing this.
Sure.
There is room for all of this. Now, what is going to be the dominant way? What is going to be the dominant thing? You know, mobile, free-to-play mobile is still technically the dominant thing. I don't think that is going to last forever. I think there will be something else that emerges beyond that. It could be more premium style games on mobile. This whole free-to-play shooter, like there's only so many games that can own these like walled gardens and people's times before they want to move on to something else. There's also the longevity of those things. Already they've pushed the boundaries of what the player base retention rates compared to most other games, and that's actually harmed the industry. Now it's made a lot of money for Epic Games and Roblox. It's made a lot of money, even though they're not profitable. But you know, are they actually doing good for the industry? Because they're preventing money from going to other new ideas, new approaches, new things, and it's all becoming the same mash. Now we've seen where there's always a rebellion moment where suddenly the player base is, you know, completely flip. And I think the challenge with like listening to all this chaos is you hear these really loud voices that say these dramatic things. Most of them don't actually know right. What they're talking about from a professional lens. Like
right.
It's not that they're completely wrong. Like a lot of them are saying things that have partial truths in them.
Right.
But they're making big, bold statements because guess what gets attention?
Right.
Big, bold statements. When in reality, you know, how big is that group? Is it 20,000 people yelling really loud? Guess what? There's 3.8 billion gamers. Like, you know, 20,000 people don't know the direction of the 3.8, and most people aren't yelling. Most people aren't even paying attention.
Yeah.
And so I think the struggle is, what do you listen to? What don't you, from a standpoint of like, believing what the consumer really desires. And the challenge from a data standpoint is you either have a lot of really general data
Mm-hmm.
across everything going on, and you have your own data, which your own data is great, except that if you don't do it right, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of your own things and your own audience. And you're not really predicting anything outside of it. You're just predicting your own audience. And if that audience is growing, awesome. But at some point, it becomes an issue. And there's nothing in between those two things. You either have something super general or too specific.
Right.
And you're trying to expand, trying to do something new. You need that in between layer. And it's really hard to find that data to tell you really what the consumer is looking for and wants. And so folks look at other platforms like a TikTok to see, well, generally, what are people, going towards? But is that really a good indication of it?
No.
But some people have gone that direction. They tried to make games that are 15 seconds, games that and yeah, if people can find success in those areas. My big thing is focus in on what you're good at and
Yeah.
what you and focus and find an audience and make sure that you're making the game for an audience, and then be ready to pivot towards who that audience ends up being, because it might be very different than what you think it is when you go into it.
Mm.
And you have to be ready and you have to be willing to adjust. And a lot of people aren't willing to adjust. They want this thing to be for what they built it for, and they don't adjust, and it dies. The people that are willing to adjust and be like, actually, we add this feature, and I mean, you look at Fortnite.
Mm-hmm.
Fortnite failed when it first launched.
Yep.
And then they added a feature because they paid attention to the audience and they were willing to adjust. It was really smart of them, as much as they copied, others to do it.
Yep.
But that's what a lot of people do. It's just like everybody else. When you see a good idea and you're able to do it in a different way, you might find that kind of perfect center of the audience, because some of these other ones that were also doing things similar, they found an audience, but did they find this huge general global audience like Fortnite did? Not quite.
Sure.
They found a really solid audience, and there's such a large audience in games in general. It's just all of these folks want to own everybody, and the reality is they aren't going to ever own everybody. There's so many different ways to play. Gaming is for everybody.
Yep.
And for every device and for everything. And that's what I'm excited about with the future here is you're going to be able to play anything on any device at any time with anybody. And that's really exciting because that creates accessibility that will expand from 3.8 billion to the full planet can play games. And so that's what I'm most excited about. But anyone that says this is the future, this is how games going to do, they're missing the point. Okay, is that the thing that might overtake mobile or free to play mobile as the largest player base? Maybe, but you're still just a slice of an overall pie that's getting more complex with every year that goes by.
Yeah, and I think I remember sitting at DICE and hearing Tim Sweeney get on a stage and talk about the bringing down of the walled gardens, and however you feel like all of that conversation has played out since that discussion a couple of years ago. And what does that mean for you as a player? I think I'm in the same boat as you. I'm like, we are in some of the best times if you're a player, because you have infinite ways that you can engage with the product and various products that are fit directly towards you. I think I am even more excited about the kind of future of games because of that. And once those systems kind of get connected, where we're able to kind of just do what we want wherever we want. And we see that with the generation that's come up after us. They don't have the same idea around exclusivity or platform or any of that stuff. They're like, is it gonna work on my phone? It's the thing I have with me all the time.
And can I play with my friends, right? Can I play with my friends? Is it easy to access? They don't want things complicated. They and if you're mindful of that, and you realize the graphics aren't everything.
Yep.
That if you're deliver a fun experience for many people at one time, awesome. But also, there's plenty of room for people with single player experiences. Everyone wants to make, again, that big headline of like, oh, a single player game's dead. And then there's something that proves like that's obviously proves it wrong. It was wrong all along. Like there's room for each of these different things, but are you focused on something that truly delivers for the player to be able to experience the way that they want to experience? And is that experience a wide enough market to actually make enough money to have a viable product that you can continually build upon and run a business off of?
I mean, and you see that bubble up in various conversations within the industry now, right? Like we're having, post Xbox and Microsoft layoffs, we're having this new conversation again, not new, but like reheated conversation around, is Game Pass terrible for developers? Is it bad for publishers? Is it bad for people who are looking to get into that space? I think that's a thing that is, a layer of discussion point that is, depending upon where you are in the funnel and who you are as a developer and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It depends on all of those pieces. Is there something that you're seeing and hearing as, last question for you before we jump out of here is there a major thing that you're seeing as an overarching narrative that kind of gets under your skin a little bit? That's like, this doesn't, like, we see this happen all the time. We see this conversation happen all the time, and it just isn't real. Like, it isn't true. It doesn't have enough facts to back it up from the people who are talking about it. And we see it kind of proliferate throughout the industry, both from a player and from maybe even a developer behind the scenes conversation that you're seeing. Is there like a nugget of something that you see right now that's like, we're focusing on this thing and that's not it, but we continue to talk about it?
Yeah, well, we continue to like pretend like this is the end of the industry, like these big companies are ruining games, are just big evil corporations. And listen, like, I'm not a big fan of these big giant corporations, but also we're the ones that built it. Like, we're the ones that are paying our money and paying them. If you really want to make a change, put your money where your mouth is and pay it to small indies that are building, trying to build a studio, but yet they keep spending on these large companies. If you want change, you have to really push for it. So I think this narrative that somehow games is in this terrible state, the reality is we're in a change moment, and which is a chaos moment. Like, there's a lot of chaos that happens in these big change moments as an industry or any industry. And you look through history, like, let's take our lessons from history. And yeah, I think things are moving faster than they ever have, but we still have many lessons we can look at and know, listen, we are in a IP turn, essentially, like a wave that is focused on de-risk. Like, they are not taking risk. They're consolidating. They're focusing in on what they're good at. And that's not a bad move. That's really smart of them, because they're in a moment in time that there's so much risk because of, platform uncertainty, consumer uncertainty, economic uncertainty. They are doubling down on what they know is going to make them money because they want to survive. Because they don't want to make the decision like Midway did, that made a bunch of bad financial decisions and then went out of business, and then that was the last great publisher in the Midwest, and they had to sell off all of their property for like $33 million to Warner Brothers. Like, imagine that, like things like Mortal Kombat and all of those properties that they had with the Cruisin' series, with that they had accidentally not copyrighted or something along the lines with NBA Jam, so they didn't have NBA Jam because of that. But still, like, they're being smart with it. Now, do people like that they're super risk averse? No. Like, and I hate it too. I hate that they're not taking risks, but I understand why they're doing what they're doing, and it's hurting the employees within the industry right now. But we also forget that during the COVID period, the industry hired like 30,000 plus people. Yeah. And so guess what? On the back end of this, like 30,000 plus people have been let go. And so we have to look at the holistic timeline and what is happening here, and then realize if we want to topple the giants, we have to create companies that will create the next wave. And so what I see this next wave as is just like when Microsoft and Apple were ruling the world and everyone thought that they were top, and things like Ask Jeeves or thought they were really great, and then Google came along and disrupted the heck out of everybody to the point that like ultimate corporate folks at Microsoft started to loosen things up, started to be like, wait a second, if we want to compete with Google, we have to like be a little bit more chill. We have to change. We have to adapt. We're going to have that. And during those periods, a lot of companies failed. A lot of really successful companies at the time failed with the disruptor company. And I think we are about to have a disruptor company or more than one come into games and do things so completely differently and disrupt. And some of these companies will fail. I have many predictions on who they are going to be.
You're right.
Some are going to adapt and succeed and then realize their only opportunity to grow and succeed and compete with this new entrance is to do something innovative. So they start to lean into risk. So they start to take more chances. They start to invest more into riskier properties. And so then it becomes the cycle of more risk taking. And then guess what? After that, there'll be another cycle of less risk taking. And so I think we just have to look at the history and know these things go in cycles. And in the moment, it's really hard to accept that because there's chaos. People are losing their jobs. And then you add on all the economic things happening especially in the US right now, but also worldwide because the US has such an effect worldwide. I think it feels like a greater weight than maybe some of the other times this has happened throughout history. And I think we just have to realize that it doesn't mean it's the end of games. It doesn't mean these big companies are going to rule forever or that, that's the only way forward. But it does mean that we need to be innovative. We need to come up with new solutions. We need to come up with new approaches. And if we succeed at doing that, I think we're gonna have a whole new wave of new companies that will create this innovation moment within the industry. And then we'll look back at this period and be like, whoa, like why were people acting the way they did? Why did they not invest more in some of these risky things? Because even like somebody like EA was built during a down market. Yep. Like during when people were against taking risks, and that's how they were built. So they were built in a moment like this, and I think some others are going to be built in a moment like this.
And I hope that changes player behavior too, to a certain extent. Like I, as a person who wants to see new things in the space from a gameplay perspective, and I want to see teams delve into new ideas and new stories and new technologies and other ways that we can be interactive together. I'm hoping for those moments too, but that also takes players to, you have to also change it up in your own layer of play, right? Like I saw this conversation pop up on social the other day that was like, oh, the games from yesteryear were so much better, but we had so much more variety. And I was like, you can't even say that these days. Like there is so much stuff to be able to play. Are you trying it? That's a different conversation in the grand scheme. So yeah, I get you on that.
But every generation, like it changes, right? The generation before us, like it was very different in how they approached it. The generation after Gen Z, which I can't remember what that one's called yet, is like it's going to be completely different.
Yep.
And at some point they're going to be like, oh, remember Gen Z and how they played games and like it's just we have to accept that it's going to constantly change. I think that, there also are generational bubbles of opportunity because for folks that want to play a game that feels more like what maybe we were used to growing up, or like Halo 1 and things like that. There are games out there that like scratch that itch, and those games have found success. And so I think if you can focus in on that and deliver upon what a consumer really wants. Now the problem is a lot of people, will make it for themselves.
Sure.
And actually there isn't a market for that thing, or they didn't market it well enough to really find that consumer and get them to get to the point of word of mouth. You have to get to the point of word of mouth in order to really capture a market. You have to create a talkable moment.
It feels now like your odds are better of making the NBA than getting your game seen on Steam. Which is a wild thing.
Well, do the math.
Yeah.
One of my favorite or least favorite stats right now, I guess, is you look 11 years ago there was about 300 games that came out a year on Steam, and not all of them succeeded, but a lot of them succeeded.
Yeah.
And then you look at last year 19,000. Guess how many games succeeded? About 300. And so, so there's it's going to be 25,000. And guess how many are probably going to succeed? About 300.
About 300.
And so it's the same amount. It's just when you do 25,000, with 300, like that's what 0.00012% chance of success if all things were created equal,
right?
Which we know that they're not,
right?
And so even if all things were created equal, your chances of success are so minuscule, which is why having a publisher matters. So to do full circle like that is why it matters, because every little thing that gives you a higher chance of success makes a big difference in an environment like this.
Well, this is why I'm happy we had you on the show, because you talked me off of many ledges while we were discussing this. And again, like I just love the thoughtful, even keel layers of understanding that you share, during our time together today. Because I think it's important to understand the scope of where we are, to have the data points that you have, and to be able to frame it in a way that is reasonable for folks to be able to understand, like, what is the thing that you're stepping into when you're coming into this space, and understanding that we as Midwest Games can be extremely helpful in getting you into the spaces that you want to get to, so you can potentially be one of those 300 in that number, in that space. Man, I could steal you for a whole another hour just to talk about a whole bunch of other stuff, man. I love getting a chance to talk to you. I love getting a chance to hang out with you and sharing this information. I think is really important for a lot of the folks who are listening to the show, who are in the industry, who are having those moments where they might have either just been laid off, or they're thinking about what it means to be a potential first-time maker of a game and looking for a publisher to work with. Ben, thank you, man. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. You have made my day. This is great. I appreciate your time. And give the folks a little bit of information at home about where they can find more info about Midwest Games.
Yeah, so you can go to midwestgames.com or go to our publisher page on Steam. So you can just search Midwest Games and follow our publisher page. We had a couple games coming out, coming up here. Tomb Water, we have a demo out for Tomb Water, which is a great Souls-like Western, Zelda-like, pixel art. And then The Legend of Babu, which, if you love like Kenna or like Legend of Zelda, but a big fluffy dog that's your companion, like that's the game for you. And then Floor is What, which is a party game that we're working on as well. And so we have a bunch of games coming up. We have a bunch of games that we've put out over the last a year and a half. And then you can follow me on LinkedIn. That's where you see me post way too much on LinkedIn. Just search my name. I'm the only one in the world, so easy to find.
Oh my goodness. Whenever you want to build that next layer of, hey, we want to get all the folks who are looking to make that career pivot, let's go into business and make that happen. I'm down to be your cohort in that space, for sure. Ben, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Appreciate you. I love your insights that you share, and continued success for you and your team, because I really do think you have something special moving here with Midwest Games. So thank you again for the time today. Everybody at home, we're going to take a quick break with some more Spawnomy on the back half of some ads. We'll be right back after this.
What if you could transform your body, level up your mind, and unleash your warrior spirit, all by playing a role-playing game? Well, now you can with Infinite, the world's first science-backed fitness fantasy RPG where real-world progress becomes your power. Create your avatar based on your goals and level. Then explore game modes like the Dungeon, Academy, and Sanctum using powerful tools and apps to forge real transformation. You ready to combine fitness and gaming to unlock your ultimate potential? Then visit fitnessfantasyrpg.com and use the code SpawnOnMe for 10% off your custom plan. Play Infinite and become the hero of your own fitness story.
Hey there, my name is Naomi, and you might know me from internet things like hosting for IGN. I'd like to introduce you to my new show, This Week in Gaming. It's 20 minutes, short and sweet, and every week I go through all the important gaming news that you need to know, and then we have folks on like Kahlief, who shows up quite often, talk about all the important news. And you get to listen to it wherever you get your podcast, so it's easy to find. Just look for This Week in Gaming and make sure to give it a follow, and every week, Monday at 9 p.m. Pacific time, you get a brand new episode. I hope you'll join me.
I want to again give a big shout out to Ben Kvalo for coming and rocking with us on today's show. I think it was a really insightful episode. We got a chance to check out and hear from folks who know. Again, I like to try to bring subject matter experts onto the show to discuss, what the topic is of the day and kind of give a good, layer of discussion for what that means. So big shout out to Ben and definitely go check out the work that they're doing over at Midwest Games. Before we go, I did want to say there's one really fun title that I'm looking forward to that just got a release date, and I would love to talk a little bit about that because it's super fun, is Time Flies. I got a chance to check this thing out. I think it was at Summer Games Fest, maybe even last year, and we didn't see if it got a actual release date. But now we get a chance to check this thing out, and it's super fun. I think it's a really interesting game that we didn't get a chance to see a genre like this really get any love in a long time, since probably like the PS3 days. I feel like games like this don't really exist except for only in the indie space. It's cool to be able to see this game get some more love, and you're kind of basically living out the time span, the lifespan of a fly. And it's just really fun. I love stuff like this where you get a chance to have weird and wacky games kind of come out and have a new flavor that I think you should definitely check out when it drops on end of July 31st, I believe. So definitely check that thing out and give it some love. So massive love to them. Massive love to Ben, and massive love to you for all checking out the episode today. So make sure that you go check out all the work that we're doing on Spawn on Me. Check out our YouTube channel, check out our TikTok, check out our Instagram. All those things are where you can find more content from me and from the rest of the crew. So we'll see you soon. Have a good rest of your weekend. Much love to you all. Peace.